Alright, so we're going to start looking at Gorbachev and the Soviet Union from 85 to 91. And the first thing that we have to do is look at these two policies called Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost was primarily aimed at the government, and Perestroika was largely aimed at the economy. And these two things are going to work together to A, destroy the Soviet Union, and B, provide an overview for, or an umbrella for, all of the policies that Gorbachev is going to implement. Okay, so our learning objectives for this video is to really understand the meanings of the terms Glasnost and Perestroika and understand sort of like the purpose that they serve. We need to understand Glasnost and Perestroika before we start looking at the policies of Gorbachev. These two terms act as the umbrella and the framework for the policies, and they will interrelate with each other, and we also use them to help us analyze the success of these policies and the way that the policies turned out. Secondly, we want to understand how Glasnost and Perestroika will be implemented and how they're going to be reflected in Gorbachev's policies. So this is, again, analyzing the successes and failures, and ultimately we need to understand how these terms work and the impact that they had on the policies in order to understand the ultimate failure of the Soviet Union. Glasnost is the main political idea that is going to shape the political policies. So Glasnost means openness, and it is a pretty vague term, and instead of looking at it as a political policy, it's probably better to look at it as a kind of umbrella that the political policies fit into. So everything that happens politically, we're going to say has some sort of root in this idea of Glasnost or openness. And Bartlett says that this was the same term used by Alexander II in his reforms. So in a way, it's going back to the history of the country, trying to find a way forward by looking back a little. And so the purpose was an attempt to strengthen the political system. Remember that Gorbachev is not some wild, crazy-eyed dude who is all about like dismantling the Soviet Union and communism. He is a communist, but he believes that there are different ways to improve and strengthen the political system. Essentially, one of the purposes of Glasnost was to allow for greater government transparency and allow for more democracy within the government, which is kind of allowing for a little bit more the real communism in a sense. However, we can say ultimately that Glasnost, although it did allow for more openness and more democracy and more transparency, what it did was reduce Gorbachev's control over events. So as we start looking at the end of the Soviet Union, we'll see that things are unfolding. And because now there's greater transparency and criticism, they are unfolding in a way that Gorbachev doesn't expect, and he's unable to control. So one of the purposes of Glasnost was to counter the obstructionism that existed within the government. So by holding the government accountable and by making things public and allowing for more transparency, then Gorbachev was hoping that he could get things done without people throwing wrenches into the system. So it's kind of like, why did a number of Khrushchev's policies fail? Why was Andropov so unable to get things done, other than the fact that he died real quick? Because there were people within the government who didn't want change because it would have hurt them. So the idea is Glasnost by people are now in glass houses, and that means that they are held accountable and they can't work in the darkness and they can't hide things and prevent the government from moving forward. And so as Glasnost increased, things like people who had been banned and outlawed under Brezhnev, like this guy here who was Sakharov, who was a nuclear physicist who opposed nuclear proliferation, who championed for human rights, and Brezhnev was not having any of that and he was exiled. So it's kind of like this openness also allows for criticism now to exist. And it's that criticism that's going to help keep people honest, help reduce corruption, and help make people follow through on what they're supposed to be doing. So by 1988, the media could freely discuss government corruption. People could discuss the economic problems, pollution. There was a discussion of Stalin's terror. And the thing is that this is a lot more open than Khrushchev's thaw. This is like the gates are just kind of wide open, and everything that had been previously taboo was now not. And now that this discussion is possible with no threat, it stimulated a desire among the public for news and debate. So people are very, very interested and invested at what is happening politically. Part of Glasnost means opening up the government archives in a way, the recognition of the things that the government has done historically and the impact that it had on people. So the Politburo set a commission to inquire into Stalin's policies and their impacts. And Reynolds says that this was Gorbachev's attempt to keep Lenin on his pedestal whilst toppling Stalin. So in order to move forward and to revamp the political system and the government, then they need to dismantle a number of the things that were set in place by Stalin. At the same time, Gorbachev is a committed communist, so he can't dismantle the idea of communism that gave the government legitimacy. So under Brezhnev, legitimacy was based on military power and kind of the nationalism and belief in the government that their international presence provided them. In a way, what Gorbachev is trying to do is bring legitimacy back to the government, but base it on ideology again and people's desire to want the government there. But ultimately, Glasnost fails because the reform of the communist system led to the collapse of power in 1990-91. So in a way, we can say that it's not just the economic problems that bring the Soviet Union down, because quite possibly, if this criticism did not exist, if this openness did not exist, if this increase in democracy did not exist, then quite possibly the Communist Party could have held on to power for much longer. And who knows? Or I'm sure you know. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986, that was the turning point to greater transparency. For those who don't know, Chernobyl was a power plant in the Ukraine, and there was a nuclear meltdown and no real discussion about what was going on. Gorbachev said that the Chernobyl disaster shed a light on the many sicknesses of our system as a whole. Everything that had built up over the years converged in this drama. The concealing or hushing up of accidents and other bad news, irresponsibility, carelessness, slipshod work, wholesale drunkenness. So basically, the Chernobyl is kind of like an exemplar of the failures of the Soviet system because of this lack of transparency, because people feel like they always have to keep information hidden. When things started happening in Chernobyl, nobody knew. They kept it quiet. They started evacuating people before they even said what was going on. It wasn't until a nuclear reactor in Sweden that is 1,000 kilometers away from Chernobyl had extremely high radiation levels on their instruments. When they measured high radiation levels and they were looking at the direction that the winds were coming from, This is when they put out an alert, and the Soviet Union had to then own up to it and make it public within the Soviet Union. Normally, whenever some disaster or something happened in an area, because the government had such control over the news apparatus, they would hush it up. And so people literally didn't know what was going on in other parts of the country. Oftentimes they thought that it was only happening in their area. And this was one of the ways that they kept control. But Chernobyl basically says that the Soviet Union can't go on like this anymore. There's a huge amount of international pressure on the Soviet Union and thereby on the domestic policies. Bartlett says that the political impact of the Chernobyl incident is similar to that of the Kronstadt Revolt in 1921. For those of you who don't remember, here's a little review. The Kronstadt Revolt was the wake-up call for Lenin and the Soviet government to roll back some of their communism and allow some liberalism within the economic system. So this was the new economic policy. And so once Chernobyl happens, it's kind of like a wake-up call for everybody else in the government that there has to be some measure or increased amount of transparency. So what he's saying is that the Chernobyl acts as a sea change and provides some support for the Glasnost policy. And it helped to highlight the problems facing communist leadership. And this is also going to lead to a fundamental shift of economic policy. So again, what we're seeing here is that there's an interrelation between these policies that may not overtly be economic and the economy. Essentially, one of the things with Chernobyl, people were not doing their jobs properly. People were not as well trained as they could have been, and there's not as much investment within the economy to keep things up to the highest level of technology. So essentially it highlighted the problems with the lack of modernization within the Soviet economy. Perestroika was the main idea about the economy that was running side by side with Glasnost. So you often hear Glasnost and Perestroika because you know what? They go together like peanut butter and jelly! But you know, in Russian. Perestroika means reconstruction. And this was also poorly defined, just as Glasnost was, and it served as an umbrella for a series of reforms that were undertaken within the years that Gorbachev was in power. And the purpose of Perestroika was to reconstruct and revigorate the Soviet state, the economy, and democratize society. So it was kind of like a bit of a catch-all. And this is how you see that it works hand in hand with Glasnost. There was no master plan. And as there was no master plan, no grand vision, it veered from left to right depending on the opposition. So sometimes it was more liberal because there was a huge push from the left to liberalize society. And sometimes it was more conservative, again, depending on whether or not he was receiving a huge amount of pressure from the more conservative members of the Communist Party. And the thing is that these relaxations, this desire to reinvigorate the state, the economy, and increase democracy was really something new for the Soviet people. And it led to this massive expansion of volunteer organizations, that is, organizations that people want to be a member of, whether it is a chess club or whether or not it is an environmental group that is trying to lobby the government. Prior to this, people were involved in organizations because they had to be, because that was part of the state control over the private lives of people. And within civil society, the people are creating more community or self-interest based organizations. And ultimately, this results in the development of a freer and more pluralistic society. And what we mean by pluralistic is plural, many. So you have a society that is not so monolithic, that is not so conformative. So, and one of the things that happens is the development of, say, political parties and things like this. So keep in tune for the next video, which looks at the implementation of Glasnost and Perestroika. And here we get to les surprises. What happens when your parents bring up grades? Or this is what I imagine happens when your parents bring up grades. Flash! Ah! I know.